If you've ever noticed that you don't really care about sports the way other people seem to, that you can sit in a room where everyone is intensely focused on a game, celebrating, reacting, emotionally invested, and you just feel disconnected from it, like you're watching something that matters to everyone else but not to you, it might seem like a small difference, but it often says more about you than you think. Because for some people, not obsessing over sports isn't just a preference. It reflects how they process meaning, identity, and emotional investment. On the surface, it looks simple. You're just not into it. You don't follow teams, you don't keep up with scores, you don't feel the need to watch every match or game. And when people ask, you might just say, "I don't really care about sports." But when you look a little deeper, it's rarely that random. You might notice small behaviors, like zoning out during sports conversations, or not understanding why people get so emotionally involved in something they're not directly part of, or feeling slightly out of place when a group bonds over a game and you can't quite relate. And that feeling, that quiet disconnect, usually points to something more internal, because sports, for a lot of people, aren't just entertainment, they're identity. They represent belonging, shared loyalty, a sense of being part of something bigger. When someone says, "we won," they're not talking about themselves literally playing, they're expressing connection. So when you don't feel drawn to that, it often means you don't naturally attach your identity to external groups in the same way. You might be more internally anchored. Your sense of self doesn't rely as much on collective experiences or shared emotional highs and lows, and that changes how things feel. Because if your identity isn't tied to a team, the outcome of a game doesn't carry emotional weight. It becomes neutral, interesting maybe, but not meaningful. And meaning is what drives attention. Without that emotional link, there's nothing pulling you in. But there's another layer to this. Some people who don't obsess over sports tend to process emotions differently. Sports are often intense, fast, unpredictable. They create spikes of excitement, tension, disappointment, relief. For many, that emotional roller coaster is the appeal. But if your system prefers stability or lower emotional intensity, those spikes can feel unnecessary, even draining. You might not consciously think that, but your behavior reflects it. You choose calmer forms of engagement, more controlled environments, things where the emotional output feels proportional. And that's not disinterest, it's regulation. It's your mind choosing what feels sustainable. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people assume that not caring about sports means you're missing out on something. Social connection, excitement, shared experiences. But the real reason often isn't about missing anything. It's about not needing that specific form of connection. Because connection can show up in different ways. Some people find it through shared teams and collective energy. Others find it through conversations, ideas, one-on-one interactions, quieter forms of bonding. So when you don't gravitate towards sports, it doesn't mean you're less social. It often means your version of connection is more selective, more intentional, less tied to group identity, and more tied to individual understanding. And that changes what feels engaging. You might notice that you'd rather spend time discussing something meaningful or exploring a topic deeply than watching a game where the outcome doesn't affect you personally. Not because one is better than the other, but because your mind assigns value differently. There's also something else underneath this. People who don't obsess over sports often have a different relationship with attention. Sports require sustained focus on something external, something constantly shifting, something you can't control. For some, that's immersive. For others, it feels like giving attention to something that doesn't return much in a personal sense. So your attention naturally moves elsewhere, toward things that feel more relevant, more aligned, more internally meaningful. And over time, that becomes part of your identity. I'm just not into sports. I never really got the hype. It's just not my thing. And those statements feel simple, but they're built on layers of how you process meaning, connection, and emotional investment. It also explains why you might feel slightly out of sync in certain social settings, where conversations revolve around teams, games, stats, and you don't have much to contribute. Not because you can't, but because you never built that connection to begin with. And instead of forcing it, you stay quiet,
or shift the conversation, or just observe. And that observation itself is part of the pattern. You tend to watch more than you attach. You notice more than you participate, at least in areas that don't naturally resonate with you. And that doesn't mean you're disconnected. It means you're selective. Selective with your attention, selective with your emotional energy, selective with what you allow to matter. And that selectivity shapes everything. Because when something doesn't feel meaningful, your mind doesn't try to force importance onto it. It simply lets it pass. Which is why sports, for you, might just remain background noise. Not negative, not annoying, just neutral. And that neutrality is often misunderstood. Because in environments where enthusiasm is expected, neutrality can look like disinterest or even detachment. But internally, it's just alignment. Your mind choosing what connects and what doesn't. So when you see people deeply invested in sports and you feel that quiet distance, it's not because something is missing, it's because your system is oriented differently, toward different sources of meaning, different forms of connection, different ways of engaging with the world. And once you start to see it like that, it stops feeling like a small preference and starts looking like a pattern. One that reflects how you think, what you value, and how you relate to the world around you. Because behaviors like this, they're rarely random. They come from somewhere. And awareness of that has a way of changing how you understand yourself and other people too. Because what looks like not caring about sports might actually be something much deeper. Something intentional, even if it wasn't conscious. Something shaped over time. And once you see that, you don't really unsee it. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, there's always more beneath the surface.